The video game industry right now is kind of in a weird spot. We seem to be getting new headlines every other week about, oh, so-and-so is doing this gaming companies do that. And I mentioned, I don't know how many cups ago, something called library. So we have this concept of backlog, games we've purchased over the years on sales or bundles or whatever it may be, especially if you're a Steam user, if you've been using that platform for a while. You end up having a tremendous amount of backlog, a just giant backlog of games to play, which I encourage you to look at a little bit differently, but because of where the gaming industry is right now, I think maybe, just maybe, we start to talk about our libraries a little bit. Now, I, for one, I'm new to Steam and the whole idea of having a Steam library, but I do have a pretty extensive Nintendo Switch library as well as a PlayStation library. This is just because of years and years of having these different consoles and pretty much cashing in on sales or free games, at least with Nintendo, with the PlayStation. But I'm at a spot now where I have easily, I can say I have hundreds of games that just haven't seen either more than an hour of play or any play at all. And in a time where we're seeing the most, I guess, odd decision making by a lot of these companies, I think looking back, and someone asks in one of the comments, well, what are we to do right now if the gaming industry is, exploding? We go to our libraries. Now, I mentioned this in a previous cut, but I want to talk more specifically about franchises. So growing up, I spent a lot of time just playing Nintendo games because my dad worked as a freelance graphic designer and one of his clients back in the 90s was Nintendo. Now, they ended up going in-house and he didn't work at Nintendo. He worked for Nintendo at the time, so he didn't end up continuing on. But he did have a short time working for Nintendo. And what was even cooler was he built some relationships along the way and we had some friends that continued to work there, and so we had this inside connection. Well, that was my life growing up in Seattle, or Bellevue rather. When we moved, he was no longer working for Nintendo. In fact, he wasn't working in graphics exclusively anymore. And so that relationship didn't continue. The friends did, but the connections didn't. Instead, I had actually changed my focus. You see, I still had a Nintendo 64 and a Game Boy, and that was very, very common for me to have both. But I ended up stopped using the N64 as much. I actually switched over to PlayStation 2. PS1 first, but then eventually PlayStation 2. My PlayStation 1 was one that I had borrowed because I couldn't afford one, and then I saved up all of my money, and then at the ripe old age of 13, I purchased my PlayStation 2. This was a huge thing for me. It was very exciting. I was introduced to a franchise back in the 90s called Final Fantasy. Now, with Final Fantasy, it was one that was a little mature for my brain. I didn't grow up playing any of the Final Fantasy games on Super Nintendo. I didn't have any of the, Japanese copies or anything like that to play as I grew up either. But in sometime in the early 2000s, I was introduced to a game called Final Fantasy X. That game, well, when I first saw Final Fantasy, it was Final Fantasy IX. 9 blew my mind. I couldn't believe there was a game that had 4 discs. This was completely wild to me. I was like, this is so much game. Holy smokes, it's so cool. I was more fascinated by the black bottom to the disc than I was to the actual disc itself, because I don't know if you know this, PlayStation games, some of them had black backs. I don't know what that was about. Anyway, moving on. I fell in love with this franchise. I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and I fell in love with Japanese RPGs after playing a little bit of Final Fantasy IX. I got obsessed with the idea of having characters that you could do different things and change their stats and stuff like that, and I ended up really falling in love with these narratives, these story-based games. And it really shaped how I looked for video games. I mean, I was already obsessed with story-based games because The Legend of Zelda was one of my first introductions to RPGs as a whole, but Zelda, they did it a little bit different. While they weren't new to the game. In fact, they just ended up switching it up a little bit. Instead of advancing through the story by leveling up your character, with The Legend of Zelda introduced in the first one, what they ended up doing was advancing through the story with the leveling up of your equipment. And that was kind of a foundational thing for the game itself. In fact, if you want to read more about that, there's a book by Bitmap Books, this one, that's a guide to Japanese RPGs. Actually, I don't know if it's in that one. I think it might be in the Famicom. It might be in the Super Famicom Visual Compendium that it talks about it. It might be in the... I'm not sure. It's one of those two. That being said, Blue, it was something that changed the game, right? And so that was my first introduction to RPGs, was Zelda. But I fell in love with the franchise, RPGs, role-playing games, specifically with Final Fantasy, because of how much involvement and how much character development that these games had. At the time, for me, it was Titus. Final Fantasy X was the first Final Fantasy game that I finished, and then I went ahead and went back and finished a bunch of other ones. But 10 was one that I was so unbelievably attached to. It was the first game I spent over 100 hours in. It was the first game that I've tried to beat more than once. It was the first game that I went out and purchased the player's guide and played through the whole game and got 100% of what I could with the player's guide. Prima's player's guide, if you guys remember those days. That player's guide was ripped to shreds. It was used so much. That game shaped the way that I looked at video games. I was like, I can't believe stories can be this intense. And I mean, if you look at Final Fantasy X, you're like, well, 10 is just kind of a rehash of 7, if we're being honest with ourselves. Cloud and Titus and, Kimahri is basically I'm not going to spoil it, but there's a lot of crossover. But that's not really the topic here. I like story. I think story is great. And if we are going through this time, this dry spell, so to speak, or this kind of dirty time in the video game industry with all the different weird company things that are happening, maybe it's time for us to turn around and look at our libraries. I mentioned this again in a previous cut, but what stories have you started and you're like, oh man, this would be fun, but then got distracted because the industry as a whole does a really good job at distracting you? Are you like me and are buying the next hottest thing because it's out there and going and trying it out, and then there's another one, and then there's another one, and all of a sudden you have all these AAA titles in your library and you haven't finished any of them? Just recently I went through and finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which I think for me was a 10 out of 10 game. The only reason why I would give it a potential 9.7 out of 10 is because the busy work. But if you skip the busy work and you just play the mainline story, I think it's a 10 out of 10 game. The mechanics are great. Everything's fun about it. I really enjoyed my experience in it, but it reminded me of something. It reminded me of how much I love that franchise. It reminded me not only of how much I loved the Final Fantasy franchise, but how much I love story-driven narrative games and how I love sharing those moments with other people. It's the very reason why the Discord community, which is open and you can get to through the link in the description, is there. We play video games together. It's a club called Play. Right now, for the month of May, we are going through Majora's Mask together and having fun with that and replaying a game of old. One that, if you have a Nintendo Switch with the Nintendo Switch Online and expansion pack, is available to you. A lot of us are choosing to play it on a retro console. I don't know where mine is. It's somewhere in my bag, which I don't know where it is right now. Oh, it's outside. I have a Nintendo 3DS, and I have chosen to go back and play it on that. We are all playing this game together, sharing our experiences, and getting excited about it, because as people going through this hobby right now, we're starting to find out that, this is kind of a dry spell. But that doesn't mean that you, as a gamer, don't have things to do. The Call of Duties and Fortnites and Apexes, all these games, these big, huge live service games that seem to be kind of taking the headlines, are so minuscule in comparison to what is actually out there. I think they just have high user counts and plenty of press and money that they overshadow what this industry was built on. Story is so important when it comes to progressing forward with these beautiful, wonderful games. I know for me, I am a narrative-based gamer. I love narrative. I mean, I am reading one of the greatest anime narratives of all time in manga form. Well, I guess it was originally this way, Dragon Ball Z. And every moment and every panel is more exciting than the last. I love stories. Stories are great. They're exciting. Movies, TV shows are kind of lacking, but a good story is so awesome. And so I was asked, what is your favorite franchise? And at first my knee-jerk reaction was to go, oh, Legend of Zelda, obviously. Because I've played most of the games in the franchise. I have been playing it since I was a very little kid, and I just love everything about Zelda. As you can see, I have books for days, and records, and plenty of memorabilia. But then I thought about it, and over on Twitch, where I stream, we did a poll. Hey, if I was to choose a franchise to play, which one would be more exciting? And it was Final Fantasy and Zelda. I haven't played all the Final Fantasy games, but Final Fantasy as a whole for me is one of the most exciting franchises that I think exist today. The games that are there have stories that I think set the standard for how to write a story. I know that they aren't the pioneers of it all and they certainly are an acquired taste for some, but when it comes to story, when it comes to excitement, when it comes to traditional Japanese style RPG, with the exception of some of their entries into their franchise, such as 16 and in some ways 7, Remake and Rebirth, the game itself has a feel to it that is recognizable across the board. In fact, you would play another game and say this feels kind of like Final Fantasy, which is really exciting. Now, there's another franchise out there that is very, very popular that went toe-to-toe with Final Fantasy, and that you can read about in that book, and that is Dragon Quest, which is a cool one. I've only played one Dragon Quest. It was Dragon Quest 1. But Final Fantasy as a whole shaped my gaming as an adult. When I got Final Fantasy X, I played that to death, as I said. And then they ended up releasing another game, Kingdom Hearts. Well, they released 10-2, which I thought was garbage, but they released Kingdom Hearts. And I fell in love with that franchise. That actually is one of my second favorite franchises of all time. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance was a game that I played for countless hours at all times, and then Final Fantasy Tactics A-2 was the DS version, which I almost exclusively played on the DS for years. That game is one of my favorite games ever. With the class system and the job system and the different types of things you can do, I love Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, or A2, or whatever they call it. The Final Fantasy series as a whole, with the magic and the crystals and all of that stuff, has a charm to it. And with Final Fantasy X, I just got engulfed in this story. I'm a Final Fantasy fan, and I think that that's fair to say. You guys probably already know that. And so the reason why I talk about this is it was exciting to me. I want to know what your favorite franchise is, but more importantly, on Discord we talked at length about it. On Twitch we talked at length about it. And as I get into one of my favorite ways to make content, which is streaming, I have decided that I want to play more video games on stream. But rather than bogging this down over here, I created a space where that's going to be more appropriately done over on Twitch, which I'm linking below. The goal is to go through all entries of the Final Fantasy franchise. I've never done that. I have every single game purchased, though. I own every single Final Fantasy game that you can on Steam. I have 1 all the way through 15. With the exception of 11 and 14 because they're online ones, and 16 is only available to you on the PlayStation 5 right now. I have them all. I have never played any of the originals, 1 through 6. Those games are, well, I guess they're all kind of originals, but you know what I mean. I haven't played some of the OGs. But I do own the Pixel Remaster, and so as it stands now, starting on Tuesday, tomorrow, and I'm strive to stream Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, 7 p.m. Pacific time. This may change over time, but as it stands now, that is the goal. I'm starting with Final Fantasy 1. This is the beginning. Then I am immediately going to Final Fantasy X because I have to play that game again. I've started it a few times. I just want to play it start to finish. And then from there, you guys choose. At least any of you who come over to Twitch and watch it. This will be completely community driven. What we play next, how we go about it. This is the most fun I think I'm going to have playing video games online in a while. We have a direction. It's Final Fantasy. I'm really excited to dive into these stories, and in a time where the gaming industry doesn't know what the heck to do with themselves, whether they're going to force you to make accounts or remove full Steam support in different countries, all of these different things, microtransactions, skins, all this stuff, I say to heck with it. Take a step back, let's look at the library and maybe explore the roots of a lot of these stories in different franchises and different forms. And so, for the next however long it takes, Final Fantasy will be the focus of the live streams. Over here, we're still talking about video games, all things. But I wanted to share this thought because I thought it was a really fun question and a realization. Just like when someone's like, do you like Zelda or Mario more? I'm like, well, of course Zelda, but it's actually Mario. It takes time. You just gotta sit back and think sometimes. Happy Monday to all of you. Enjoy your days. I really enjoy making these cups of coffee. AeroPress today, delicious as always. But as always, on top of that, happy gaming. Go over to Twitch. Join me in the streams. It'll be fun. All right. See you around.